Hello, I'm Charles Russell and I'm doing a series of videos on JavaScript. And the subject of today's video is iterations. Now I'm going to try to keep this one a little shorter because I want to get on to actually showing you some of this stuff in a practical sense, so it kind of puts it together. Now the reason why I chose iterations, it's very closely related to our previous video in which we were looking at branching. In branching, we are trying to choose, based upon some condition, one path amongst many possible paths. Now, it's sort of like switching a train on a track. But that may not be the only kind of directional change we want. We may want to repeat a block of code over and over again. Why would we want to do that? Well, let's imagine that we have got a list of names and we are trying to find a particular name in that list. Or I'm trying to send a group email and I have to look through I have to make sure that that email is constructed for every person on that list. In other words, what we're trying to do here is loop. Iteration is the computer science term for looping. So the very first of these loops we're going to talk about is the while loop. Now in the while loop, the condition that you're trying to evaluate for is going to be checked at the top. This is really useful if I don't know how many times I'm going to execute. In other words, we're looking for that list. So while we don't have some value, we're going to keep looping. The condition is set at the top, and it looks just like what I have here, where I have a while, then I have the conditional expression, and then we have a code block that we're going to execute. Now you want to make sure that that conditional expression eventually will evaluate to false. Otherwise, you'll get what they call an infinite loop, which is a very common beginning level programming mistake. Another thing I want you to note here is this: because the conditional expression is at the top, it's possible that we don't execute this code block at all. Now we have a choice we can do here. We could set some sort of value so that our conditional expression is going to initially evaluate to true no matter what. But another thing you might want to consider is something called a do loop. So while a while loop is going to check for the conditional at the top, the do or do while loop is going to check for the condition at the bottom. And it's going to continue to do that until whatever condition at that bottom evaluates to false. So its structure looks like this. You have the keyword do followed by an opening code block. And at the end of the code block, you're going to put in a while conditional expression. Now, if that conditional expression evaluates as true, you're going to go back to the top of the do. If it evaluates to false, you're going to fall out of the loop. Now, sometimes this is really great when you have some sort of indistinct truth or false. You're looking for a particular value or something. But let's say I want to control how many times a loop is executed. Well, the really good structure for that is the for loop. For the for loop, we're going to say, okay, we're going to keep doing this some X number of times. Now this basic for loop, and there is another for loop we'll talk about in a minute, has kind of like 3 statements inside of it. The first one is like an initialization statement. It's going to execute before the first iteration and never again. They usually use this first statement for initialization. Now the second one is a conditional expression. This is the condition with the loop's going to be checked. Now the third one is kind of interesting. It's going to execute after the next iteration, but before the conditional check. Now, it's usually used to say increment or decrement some value. So if I put this syntax together, this is what you have. You have for, and I'm going to call init for that initialization, that statement 1. Then you have a semicolon, and then some sort of conditional expression. And then you're going to have what I call prep for next. It's usually an incrementer or a decrementer. Then you're going to have this code block. So if I was to say in a practical sense, I could say sort of something like for I equal to 10, I less than 20, I plus plus. In this case, I'm setting the initial value to 10, and I'm saying the conditional expression that I'm less than 20. Then I am going to I'm going to increment a value. What this means is this code block will execute 10 times. Okay, that's pretty cool. And you would think that I couldn't. A lot of people say, well, I can't do an infinite loop here. Well, consider this. If I say I equal to 1, and my conditional expression is I less than 1, and then I put I plus plus, I will never be less than 1. So again, I'll be caught in that infinite loop. Be careful of this kind of thing. This is very common for people to make these kinds of mistakes. Now, there is another variant of the for loop that I almost didn't cover, but because I want to stay in the iteration, subject iteration, I'm going to. This may not make much sense because we haven't talked about functions or objects yet, or arrays. We'll try to come back to this after this discussion, but I want to kind of introduce it here because it is one of the iterative loops. Now, a couple of things before I say what it does, I want you to realize there is a catch to this loop, and it has to do with something called inheritance. Again, a subject you don't know about yet, but basically, if a property exists in a parent or in any of its parents' parents, or its parents' parents' parents, this is going to be checked. So you could end up checking for a lot more values than you should, slowing down your execution program. So that's why to avoid that, we use something called a property of all object called has own property. Now, what this for loop here we're going to talk about is going to be used to examine the properties of an object. So its syntax looks like this. For some variable in some object. Usually this is an array or some other object you've constructed. If that object has its own property, that is the variable, then we're going to execute a block of code. That's kind of the general structure and how this is generally used. I know this is kind of confusing because I'm using terms like inheritance and objects and arrays that we haven't discussed yet. But we will, and you will find that once we've done this to be an extremely useful iteration. Now, sometimes we want this loop to stop right away. Let's say that I am going through some sort of for loop. And all of a sudden I found something that says, okay, we know that this can't happen. That no matter how many times we loop through, what we're looking for is not going to be found. So what we might want to do in that case is just break. In other words, we're going to stop the execution of the code block right at that point. And then we're going to discontinue loop. We're going to follow the statements after the loop. Now, a similar keyword is continue. But continue is different than this. That, okay, for this iteration, there is no sense doing any further code in this block. So what we want you to do is stop this iteration and pick up with the next one. So let's look at what we talked about in this video. In this video, we looked at iteration. and we defined it as another word for looping. While loops check for conditionals at the top of the loop, but we want you to be really wary of doing infinite loops. Do loops checks for conditionals at the bottom of the loop. The basic for loop allows loops to be controlled by the number of executions, and for len loops will check the properties of objects and arrays. We want you also to be sure to use the hasOwnProperty method. Well, that's it for the iteration. I'm going to try to do some practical code next and see what we can do about giving you a little bit better understanding of this before we start jumping into the more complex ideas of functions and objects. Until then, that's it. Thanks. Bye.